All right, the last video lecture in our second part of Unit 3 on learning is cognition's role in learning. So learning can happen, we have found, without having to have reinforcements or punishments present or associations as we see in classical conditioning, but rather we can acquire knowledge and skills more passively. And that's what this module 3.9 focuses on, is how else do we learn besides through those rewards and punishments and operant conditioning or those associations we see in classical conditioning. So the first thing that led to this was the idea of a cognitive map and latent learning. And so there was an experiment that was done where they took rats and they put them into a maze, and they just let them explore this maze. There was no reward given, no nothing. The rats just got to explore this maze. Okay, take those rats out. Another set of rats were put in and were rewarded with with some sort of treat at the end of making it through the maze. So once they can figure out their way out of the maze, they get that treat. The third rat was not, or the third category of rats were not placed in the maze at all. Then, fast forward, they took each of those three groups of rats and they put a reward incentive at the end of the maze, and they timed how long it took for the rat that just was in the maze without the reward to begin with, the rats that were in the maze before with a reward to begin with, and the ones that never went in the maze. And they found that the two rats in the first two conditions, those two groups, performed equal to one another, meaning the rat that was put in there without a reward given did just as well as the rat that was put in there with a reward given. And it was only the third category of rats who were never given a reward and never able to see that map before, or that maze, that did the worst. So that leads to the point that there was learning that happened for those rats that weren't given the reward of food at the end of getting through that maze. Rather, something had to have happened for those rats. They had to have created some sort of what they call cognitive map, or it's almost like a map of this maze in their brain. They must have somehow gotten that in there without a reward being present to do that. And so that led them to a discovery called latent learning, that sometimes learning happens and we don't show that we have that learning until some incentive is given to us. So in the case of the rats, they were learning. They created a cognitive map of that maze, but they didn't show that they could do it as very quickly until they were given that reward at the end of the maze to show how quickly they could make it through. So to kind of relate this to you, think about you in the car, right? You drive everywhere with your parents, and you go far and close distance, and you constantly take a very similar route back to your house. Well, let's say you are in the car with somebody who's never been to your house before, who's driving you home, and for some reason, the internet, they can't get on maps, they don't know how to get home. You probably would be able to tell them how to get home using the cognitive map that you have created in your head. You weren't rewarded. You weren't told to memorize how we get home. That thing just happened naturally. You created a cognitive map without your conscious awareness of it, without being given a reward for it, without having any associations to do it. And therefore, when you were in a position where the reward was being able to get home, you all of a sudden were able to show your learning. So this indicates that learning can happen without having a reward or consequence present, without having to have an association. We also know there's something called insight learning. And insight learning is exactly what the word is, insight, where all of a sudden we are able to solve problems, where it's almost like we get a light bulb that comes on and we are able to solve a problem that before we weren't able to solve. So without being told how to solve a problem, without being rewarded for solving the problem, without watching somebody else solve the problem, giving time to think through a problem can lead to what we call insight learning. So for example, what we see with this monkey here is we see this monkey who's wanting to reach the bananas, and through time and having an opportunity to work through it, they figured out that, they can stack those boxes and be able to reach that. Or, we get on top of that box and we can't reach that anymore. I can use a stick to help reach those bananas if I don't have it. And so the idea is that if we sit with something, we sit with a problem, sometimes insight learning occurs, and sometimes we get the response, we get the answer without actually being reinforced to get there or punished to get there. And finally, the most popular type is something called observational learning, or learning that happens through modeling. And this comes from a man named Albert Bandura, who took 36 boys and 36 girls, and he exposed them to either the same sex or an opposite sex, either aggressive model or a non-aggressive model. So he broke it down into multiple different experimental conditions. And then what they did is they observed the behavior of the children, whether or not they showed aggressive behavior when being placed on their own in a room. And so he wanted to see, did a same-sex model being aggressive or opposite sex model being aggressive impact the child's aggressive behavior themselves? Did the non-aggressive model impact that child more? Did no model impact that child? And so we will have a chance in class to look at what is the data that he found of the impact of learning through observation, learning through watching somebody modeling a behavior. Did that cause you to copy the behavior, or did that cause you to not copy that behavior? Spoiler, what he's going to find is that we do learn by observation. We do copy the behavior of those who show us both good and bad behavior, which leads us to our understanding that observational learning can lead to both prosocial and antisocial behavior in those that are observing. So prosocial behavior, if we are around and we see other people acting in kind, caring, generous, sharing ways, we find that others are going to behave in those same ways. When we are surrounded by people who are have anger or respond with violence when they're upset, we tend to find that those individuals tend to do that same thing. So if you come, depending on the kind of family environment you are observing all the time, will impact what type of behavior you have out in the real world, or the observations of those friends or family members or, teachers, community members that you see. You will tend to take on those characteristics of those that you are exposed to most often. So it's kind of the good and the bad of observational learning. It has the power to do good things, but it also has the power to bring out negative things in us. So what's happening biologically when observational learning is occurring is something called mirror neurons. So what they've discovered is that we have specific neurons in our brain that activate both when we take an action and when we see somebody else take an action, which is why observational learning is so powerful, is those neurons are strengthening their connections both through us doing an action repetitively, as well as us watching somebody else do an action repetitively. And so we are able to learn through that observation because those synaptic connections are being strengthened through watching as well as through doing. And therefore, it helps us to be able to better repeat that same behavior. That is it for today. We will address this module in class. Have a wonderful day.